sanction stuff, especially since as time goes on and alternate supplies are got, especially when it comes to European energy supplies, right? Gas and oil. As the European economies restructure, the gas supplies restructure, oil supplies restructure properly, by mid next year for sure. That will make it a whole lot easier for governments to keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, because there will no longer be this, But on the other hand, we're now paying more for energy, or it's harder to get energy, or more importantly, now there's energy uncertainty, right? Especially that part of it. Finance. Anything I missed out? And then we're going to go to Darrow and Big Pop and Piotr. Finance. Okay, is it just me who can't? Okay, I can't hear finance, and finance left. Finance will be back. It's awfully glitchy, but for everybody who's annoyed with glitches, we're restarting the space in about an hour and a half, and then it hopefully won't be glitchy anymore, but maybe it still will be glitchy. Finance, if you can make your way up real quick, that'd be great. Okay, he's back. Finance.
Yes. Finance? Hi, what's the question? Sorry, we're having some technical issues.
So Nick and I were just talking about, how much would Russia's already using a whole lot of their Cold War stock of equipment, tanks, shells, etc. They are investing vast proportions of their military stockpiles in this. They have probably used up, 60-70% of their caliber cruise missiles, for example. They probably used up about half of their total stock of standoff weapons, standoff non-nuclear weapons, that is. So, this goes on for many more months, and Russia isn't currently able to replace much of the more modern stuff because of the sanctions. And we're just saying, if these sanctions persist for a little while after the war, Russia just will not be able to remilitarize effectively, right? So Nick was pouring a little bit of cold water on this, saying, if the war is over, if Ukraine reclaims its territory, Russia won't be seen as much of a threat. The sanctions won't be applied as stringently anymore. Companies which are now observing not just the letter but also the spirit of the sanctions might be trying to find more loopholes in them. Where do you come on this divide, really, of what happens, let's say, after the war, when maybe the application of the reasons for the application of sanctions aren't as clear as they are now as the war rages?
Okay, two parts of this. One, too many atrocities. It is going to be hard for Russia to have a fully unsanctioned regime in a post-war environment, as after the war, we're just going to find out more and more and more for years of the horrors that they have inflicted. Right now, all we know of Kherson is what a couple partisans have gotten out to the media, and it sounds like fucking Auschwitz-Birkenau. I'm not being facetious. I never, ever like using Holocaust comparisons. If you know me, which many of you only know me from this space, I literally shout down everybody who uses them. But this is the first time in my life in the modern world I've heard about 24/7 crematorium and the cloud and the sky thick with the clouds of cremated human remains, of mass torture, systemic killing, etc. This sounds okay. If you want to say it's more like the Warsaw Ghetto or something, whatever. We're still looking at the kind of horrific atrocities that people do not think is acceptable. They didn't think it was acceptable from World War II. They don't think it's acceptable now. I don't expect Russia, even if the current dictator were to die a natural or unnatural death, to be willing to give up absolutely everybody who was involved in all the atrocities, and we're just going to keep finding out more and more about it. And if they're not going to give up everybody involved in the atrocities, there's going to be a lot of people completely unwilling to work with them. And even in places where I believe that the sanctions will pretty quickly come down, a la, say, Europe will just go back to buying natural gas really quickly, they're going to have major issues getting foreign investment and getting foreign experts and people to build out their heavy industry, because people aren't going to trust investing billions of dollars in Russia, because who knows if you're just flushing that money down the toilet. Given those issues, the Russian economy, yes, some of the sanctions should come down. All of them will not, but a lot of this damage is done and is going to be done. The gentleman we had on who worked on the Yale report said those guys are expecting a 50% decline in Russian oil output over the next decade. That number even shocked me, but since I'm sitting here talking about a 17 to 20% decline year over year at the rate they're going, I can't think it's all that shocking, given that once they start breaking down their ability to get these wells and some of their midstream infrastructure of, and their pipelines and things, it's not so surprising. And the rest of their economy sort of looks worse. So, one, too many horrors. We're going to keep hearing more. Russia would have to take accountability to really get out of a heavy sanctions regime, which I don't expect them to. And Ukraine's not going to stop showing the pictures of this shit because they shouldn't, and it's going to be bad. Whatever we've seen now is not as bad as what we're going to know about in 6 months, which isn't as bad as we're going to know about 6 months after that, as more information comes out and Ukraine reclaims more or hopefully all of its territory, hopefully sooner. The longer that takes, the more atrocities will be committed, and the more shit will eventually come out. So I think that that's going to make it real hard for Russia to get out of sanctions, at least completely. And certainly, even if they are, what company wants to go invest a few $1 billion in a country where that could go poof?
Exactly. A lot of this will be very high country risk for anybody wanting to invest in Russia afterwards, unless Russia, goes through the unimaginable, which is a thorough regime change, and that's something that's just really unlikely to expect in the short order, right? And if they do, then you just have the same sort of country risk as you had in the early '90s, when you think, who knows who's going to run these things next year or in a month from now. So either way, either it will still be very much unpalatable to talk to the people who have just been stopped from committing a massive genocide, or those people won't be in charge anymore. But then who will be the ones in charge, and how trusting will any company be of who's going to be in charge when when the time comes for them to pay up, in a month or a year or whenever. So there's a lot of components there. I'm sure we're going to touch on more momentarily. Let's go to Daryl and then to Piotr. Daryl?
Hey, I'm going to go and change the subject just slightly. And this goes back to what CJ was talking about with the hits on the airport. I just want to know, is there any video footage of whether the fuel bowsers were hit or the tanks? Because what I'm looking at is I'm trying to see if their supply of jet fuel, which they would need for like the helos.
Do you mean in Crimea?
Yes.
I'm gonna tell you that I haven't seen any satellite pictures or anything, but if those giant fireballs weren't fuel, then I'm gonna eat my shoes for dinner.
Yeah, I was just, because if they're the main supply for all the satellite helicopter bases that they had around, then that's another thing that they're going to be limited in doing without even hitting the other fuel depots. Is once they run out of fuel, they're going to have a longer distribution line to get fuel for those other bases, which kind of grounds their air power. Even though it was not used as much, they have been using it either to ferry troops or move for lighter operations. So that's one other thing that I was wondering about, and if that's even the situation with the fuel supply.
So it's a little bit beyond me to say, what the situation with the fuel supply precisely is. But I'm going to tell you there's definitely a lot of fuel that went up in a couple of giant fireballs because those were fuel. That is just how a very large amount of fuel that's partially vaporized to start with looks like when it blows up, because they were I don't know, 200-foot fireball mushrooms, maybe taller. Can't really tell very well, but they're gigantic. And that is filmed from a very long distance, and they're very wide as well. It's a classic fuel up in flames. Daryl?
Yeah, did you see the different colors? That was something that I was looking at, and I saw the two different colors of the fire, of the smoke.
Yeah, one looked more like diesel, one looked more like petrol or jet. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was, when I saw that, I didn't know whether that was a chemical or if that was, or I know black is fuel, but I was looking at the white, wondering if that was chemical though.
I think the more black is diesel, the more white-yellow one is probably jet. I would suspect, but that's either way. Daryl, I think you and I are gonna have to wait for a few more hours for some satellite images to come through, so that we can actually see what happened down on the ground. Because now we can speculate forever, but we just won't come a whole lot closer. I am very curious to see how many planes actually got it. Ukraine initially said only 9. I bet it's more, but we're gonna have to see.
Yep. And the other thing, if that was the main fuel depot, that kind of limits what they can get from the port, because I'm pretty sure there are pipelines that lead from the ports to pump fuel up to that air base. So they would actually have to pump it right. I mean, have it come right from the port.
So this was either the second or third largest airbase that Russians have on Crimea. They have one right next to Sevastopol. I would suspect that's probably the main one. This, I think, was a naval airbase that was also used for training jets that were meant to be based on the aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov, the famous quote-unquote coal-powered, but not really coal-powered aircraft carrier that keeps being in repairs. Because they have the same sort of takeoff ramp there for training, like a replica of the one on the ship built on land. So I think it's a somewhat smaller airbase, this one, and I don't think this would be the main one that would be for Crimea. There's a bigger one by Sevastopol.
Okay, thanks.
Cheers, Daryl. Piotr.
Hey, how's it going? I will attempt to speak, but if I get cut off because for some reason Twitter is not working.
Yeah, pay attention to your screen. If we don't hear you anymore, I'll drop you to listeners so that you know that we can't hear you, because you can't hear us either at that point.
I'm gonna revert back round to the sanctions because that was interesting and somewhere that I've got more experience. So just a few points here that I wanted to add to what others were saying. I think sanctions are often lauded as the sort of pinnacle policy tool, and they're very sexy, and then the flashy ones, and they're the most obvious economic state warcraft kind of, or example of economic warfare that a country has. But they are slow, and they are used most effectively when part of a comprehensive policy package. So one of the tools in the toolbox, along with diplomacy, cultural engagement, negotiations, all that sort of stuff. And a good example is Liberia. So in the early 2000s, there was the remnants of the Liberian Civil War. And because of the effectiveness...
We lost Piotr, right, Ben?
Yep. No Liberia. We won't know what happens in Liberia.
Piotr, what we feared would happen happened. Please request to speak again, and then we can continue from Liberia. There's 457 people eagerly waiting to learn what happened in Liberia.
Well, I guess what happened in Liberia stays in Liberia.
Apparently, technical difficulties are a part of life around here, aren't they? Okay, we have Piotr back. Piotr, you dropped off just as you brought up Liberia.
Yeah, so sorry about that, everybody. I'm just trying to say that Liberia is a really good example of where sanctions, if used as part of a comprehensive package, can actually have quite a constructive impact, in that they help by sanctioning the right people in the right way. They helped to reduce the war by about 10 years, by 5 to 10 years in some analysts' estimates, and get about 100,000 fighters to give up fighting or come to a ceasefire. So they can be effective, but you have to judge them by their original policy objectives. And they are slow, but what we are seeing is that they can work. And I'll use two examples. So one is Russia. In 2015, the first round of sanctions, which were predominantly asset freezes and travel bans against the oligarchs and the inner Kremlin, helped to deter Russia from undertaking the military campaign that it is now doing. Now, you can argue, well, they haven't really worked because Russia's invading, which is a fair point, but at least in the short term, at that moment, they did work. Second example is that they cut the Russian economy by about $500 billion. So around 2015, the Russian economy was about $2.2 trillion, and it shot down over the time to about
20%.
Yeah, so they have an impact. It just takes time. The other country that I think is a really good example is Iran. And so when Iran was sanctioned in 2011, their GDP growth cut by 7.5% in just 1 year. There were other factors as well, like Stuxnet, the cybernetic attack involving the British, Americans, and Israelis. And it was only over until 2015-16, when the sanctions were lifted partially, when the Iranian deal was signed, that you saw these huge growths grow. Now, I'm not going to go into whether or not the deal you like or not. That's another debate. But I'm just saying the sanctions did have a notable impact on the Iranian economy.
Full alert. This message has been generated with municipal data.
Iran's oil output went from about 3.6 million barrels of oil a day to they dropped by about 40% in just over 6 months. So the sanctions that are happening with Russia are going to be fully felt. We've never seen a country of this size to this extent sanctioned before. We've never seen the Swiss sanctions done to this extent. There are flaws with the Swiss sanctions because they don't target every single Russian bank, so there are loopholes. But there are a couple of other things, which is sanctions have a knock-on effect of people being unable, as you guys have already mentioned, getting basic products like something as arbitrary as a piece of kit for your car, or very small pieces of products that people take for granted to leave the summer. They're all partying, they're going on holiday, and they enter the winter months where they're at home.
Here's Siren Alert Update. Venetia, full alert. This message has been generated with municipal data.
Schon so lange an der Front kämpfen, blieben in der Heimat, als die Bomben in die Dächer krachen. Flammen gehen aus, weil sie weiterhin die Stellung halten. Russische Orks sind am Plündern und Morden. Sie verlieren ihre Panzer in Trümmern am Boden. Sie verleugnen unser Volk wie die Grenze unseres Landes. Aber ganz egal, denn sie sind dieser Stärke nicht gewachsen. Unter Russland, das